Recently I was sitting in a boardroom with 2 graduate assistants, and we were doing a study and we were trying to understand how to look at the data and analyze it. And one is in the School of Psychology and one's in the School of Education. And the one in the School of Psychology, we'll call her Jordan. And as I'm going through the statistical analysis that we're about to do, she's just nodding her head. Haley, in the College of Education, later confessed she only took statistics in her undergrad, and she hadn't taken her statistics course yet. And education was blank. She had no idea what I was talking about. She was having a hard time. And all I was saying is we're going to do an ANOVA. We're going to do within and between the groups. We're also going to make sure that maybe we'll do a chi-square, kind of take a look at things. And we're looking for significance. And so Jordan looks over at Haley and says, "Do you understand what he's talking about?" And Haley goes, "Some of the words." And she goes, "So what are we trying to do? Significance?" She goes, "We're looking for those big changes, right?" And Jordan said, "No, actually that's not what significance is." See, to Haley, the word significant means big change. But in statistics, it just means that we can reliably say that there is a difference. It can be 0.1 or it could be 10 billion. It doesn't matter. If there's a statistic that's not based upon variation or error, or randomness and error, then it's significant. And for her, it was kind of an eye-opening experience to say, oh, so that's what, oh, that makes sense to me. Now we can go on with our conversation because now she's on board with the terms that we were using. Have you ever had that experience before?
Yeah, really, just recently. I was just out watching my practicum students teach their practicum lesson, and my teacher candidates taught academic language beautifully. I had one teacher candidate, one of my best teacher candidates, taught the lesson. What she wanted her students to do was to group words by initial phoneme. And so she taught grouping, the language function, and gave tons of opportunities to practice and really supported her students to meet that language function. One of the opportunities to practice was she used Post-it notes with words on it and wanted to use graphic organizers to sort the words by initial phoneme. Another opportunity to practice was she had the students sort their names by initial phonemes, so they were grouping their names by initial phonemes. Some of the supports that she used was she used graphic organizers, she used think, pair, shares, she used visual aids to scaffold the learners. But her last opportunity to practice, she gave each student a Post-it card and had a picture on it. And she wanted her students to look at the picture and then group by initial phoneme. So she walked around, monitored progress, used her assessment checklist, and she saw a misconception immediately. She saw that her students did not know or could not recognize what the picture represented. So they weren't able to group by initial phoneme. She used corrective feedback, redirected her students in order for them to master the language function. That's the case. When we don't teach academic language, we're not giving our students equal opportunities to meet the objective. With her corrective feedback, she was able to redirect them in order for them to be successful in grouping by initial phonemes.
Yeah, and as I listen to you, it's really funny standing back here because I remember whenever I was my Master's of Education, my undergraduate's not in education, but I went and I became a teacher and then got my Master's in Education. If you listen to Christy, she did a very good job explaining everything if you understand academic language. Phoneme, monitoring, corrective feedback, wall words, I don't know what else, assessments, yeah, benchmarks, goals. We all understand these things. We're educators. So for us to kind of put ourselves in our students' place, let me walk you through some academic language you may not know. And I want you to feel confused. And I want you to feel under the pressure of what am I going to do next? And what is going to happen? Because I'm going to walk you through what I've observed my students going through. And why they don't understand academic language. Because if we can't teach academic language to our students, if we can't recognize the words that we roll off our mouths very quickly so that we can communicate concisely with each other, if we can't teach that to our students, they have no chance of teaching it to their students. And that's where we're going to be measured. Not by what our students can do, but what they can teach others to be able to understand. That's edTPA. So, let's go back. Let's see if it works. Let's go back to Economics 101. Now, I'm not an economics person at all. My brother is a political science statistician. He gave me this example. I thought it was great. So we're going to go back, and basically, you're taking a test. And this is what you're asked to define. Take this definition by Ayn Rand and define it. Every aspect of Western culture needs a new code of ethics, a rational ethics, as a precondition of rebirth. What does that mean economically? Why don't you take 30 seconds and figure out what you think it means in economic terms? You can discuss. It's totally fine. If you're standing in the back, there are some seats up here too. If you want to join in, it's totally fine. I really wanted to make this real. I would call upon people. I would voluntold you to tell me what you thought. I borrow that from Pam. Okay, so let's just be honest. Let's raise our hands. How many people know what rational ethics in economic terms really means? Good, because I do. Here's what your students do, and you know they do this because they do it every day when you ask them questions. Define. I understand what that means. I need to read something. I've got to locate what I need to define. So they say, I know the word rational. I know that's a word. And I know there's a term ethics. So rational ethics, they don't even see it as a term. They see it as rational, and they see it as ethics. So then what they do is they say, rational plus ethics must mean rational ethics. So they say, well, rational means sensible, and ethics means code of a moral code. So a rational ethics is a sensible moral code. Awesome. So they write on their paper, we need to act in a reasonable or sensible manner in the future. This will lead to the best outcome for our culture, maybe economically. How many came close to that? Yes. So far away. So far away. Really, let me do this. Rational ethics, rational means, in economic terms, you do what's best for you, regardless of the outcome to anybody else. You do whatever is best for you, regardless of the outcome of anybody else. Great. So when my brother we were talking about this, and I said, I'm going to use this term. He goes, great. He goes, one time, and this is aside, completely aside, one time he was actually in an apartment complex, and the next guy over to him was completely nuts, and actually fired a bullet through his wall into his apartment. Okay? And when he was interviewed later on, after he got arrested and everything else, they said, what were you going to do? And he goes, well, I was either going to shoot the voices I heard in the other room, or I was going to take my own life. To which my brother said, in economic terms, he made the rational decision. Because he didn't hurt himself, he did what was best for him. So, according to Ayn Rand, everybody needs to maximize their pleasure, minimize their pain in order to do whenever they're making decisions. You know, really forget morality. In some ways, capitalism in its purest form is what she goes for. That's what she said. How many came close to that? Okay, so it should be confusing for you. It should be absolutely confusing for you. And that's what I want you to feel. Because your students are feeling that whenever we roll those academic terms and education off our tongue. And they're not tracking with us. If we're not taking the time to teach them the academic language and what these mean, then we're not doing our jobs to help them be successful for what they need to be. So the question is, what is academic language?
I'm simple, so let's make this simple. Academic language is the language of the discipline. And so it's the language that our students need to know, to understand, to participate, to engage fully in the lesson. Just like the example of my teacher candidate, the language function was grouping. And so because her students couldn't recognize the pictures, they weren't able to group by initial phonemes. What are we evaluating? Do they understand the pictures, or they were able to group the initial phoneme? And so if we're not teaching every aspect of academic language, then our students are not going to be able to be successful in grouping the initial phonemes. And therefore, when we teach academic language, we're making learning personal, meaningful, and relevant to our students and giving them every opportunity to meet the language function. So we want them to participate fully. When we don't do this, then it's inequity. We're not allowing all students equal opportunity to understand. So this is what we ask our teacher candidates to do, and this is what Matt and I are going to ask you to do today, and I'm so excited. I love edTPA. I have seen my teacher candidates, when they fully understand academic language, how it really has improved their teaching. And so they're going to have to identify the academic language demands, which are the language function. You're going to choose a verb. You have content vocabulary. Now, content vocabulary is the vocabulary that the students need to know in order to successfully understand the language function. Then you have syntax and you have discourse. Syntax is small organization, discourse is larger, where you're explaining orally or written, but we'll break that down individually. Our students, our teacher candidates, need to give their students opportunities to practice. Major misconception with my teacher candidates at first. They were like, opportunities to practice is me teaching. Well, no, edTPA is the shift. It's not teacher focused, it's student focused. And so opportunities to practice means, how are you, the teacher candidate, giving students opportunities to practice the language function? And we're going to show you and give examples. In my example of my teacher candidate of grouping initial phonemes, she gave them opportunities to practice by using the Post-it notes, by grouping them by names, by using the pictures. All of those, they were engaged in the academic language. And then we have to describe how you will support your students. Our teacher candidates have to say, how are we going to support? But it's support through the language function. I tell my teacher candidates that the language function is like the lens of how they're going to see their whole lesson, and that really has helped them. And so, how are you supporting them to meet that specific language function? It can't just be a support that has nothing to do. edTPA wants to know, how are you supporting them with that? And then we have to explain how the students are using it and provide evidence across the nation. Across the nation, this is our weakest part, assessment. And so my teacher candidate saw the misconception. They're not going to say, oh, you had a misconception, you're scored low. They're going to say, okay, you had a misconception, what are you doing to redirect them? And she did that. And so how are you assessing? What are they producing? And are you giving feedback that's related to the standard, that's able to, our teacher candidates will be able to redirect their students back to learning? So those are the components of academic language, and we're going to break this down, and we're actually going to have you participate and to see what our teacher candidates actually feel like and have to do.
So as we said before, we have 4 language demands. We have language function, content vocabulary, syntax, and discourse. And in a way, this is how you engage things. Within communication, if I want to tell somebody to do something and they have to understand what I say, there's actually 6 steps. I have to react to something that happens, then I have to think about the words I want to say, then I actually have to say the words. They have to hear the words, they have to translate the words, and then they have to do what I've asked them to do. Now, we do this naturally. We do this very quickly, as we've said before, and with academic language, it's the same way. Here, language function we said is the verb. So basically, what are you going to ask your students to do? That's it. It comes right out of the central focus. If you look at the edTPA handbook, you will see whenever we go through task 1, one step will say, what is your central focus? The next step will say, what is your academic language? They're connected. Once you do that, once you figure out what you want your students to do, then what happens is you have to figure out what vocabulary they have to understand. Okay? Vocabulary and function are pretty easy to understand. Most people that I talk to in academic language, they get that. I want them to, and I'll just go to the next slide so you can see it. Here we go. We asked you to analyze and define rational ethics. Did I not? So what was my vocabulary? It was actually, it was rational ethics. Okay? That was pretty easy. I need to analyze and define. I understand that. Once I understand what the definition of rational ethics is, then I can start to engage. The problem is syntax and discourse, for some reason, is hard to understand. And some of it's because of definitional problems. I actually had a conversation this morning, and I told this person that I was going to use our conversation, and here it is. She asked me, what is syntax and discourse to you? And I said, this syntax, according to edTPA, is any kind of organization in which you use for communication. It can be a sentence, it can be a paragraph, it can be a section, it can be a comma, it can be where the adjective goes with the noun. And then discourse is that overall, do you understand what's going on? Do you have an understanding? Can you read the entire chapter? Can you read the reading and understand what the author is saying? The person I was talking to said, well, in my discipline, and we all come from different disciplines, she said, syntax is Spanish, the adjective comes after the noun. Casa bueno, not bueno casa, right? It's a good house, well, you say house first. Because for me, that's syntax. And I said, that falls in line with edTPA. It can be something as simple as where the words go, or a comma, or a sentence, or an exclamation point. But they have to read and understand what's going on there. How is it organized? How are your thoughts organized? In this, you read the question, and you noticed, and you said within this question, here's the term my professor is really asking me about in economics. You could understand the syntax of that question, and you could understand what was really being asked. That's syntax. That's understanding what in that sentence I need to define. Those two words, that term. Finding that term is the syntax. And then writing the discourse is understanding, bringing in that understanding. Now in that conversation this morning, discourse was defined two ways. In Spanish, I can have a conversation. I can have discourse. I can understand the language and respond to it. But then there's also the big D discourse, that's the understanding of what are my optimal responses when somebody says good morning? Buenos dias, right? Or good day. How do I put that together? What are my options? Do I understand those underlying factors, those underlying principles of what's really there? Do I understand those definitions within the context? So in my example of economics, not only could you use the syntax, the organization of the question to understand what you're supposed to do, the language function, and use the vocabulary, but can you then respond to it and place that definition in economics in a way that's understandable to the professor? So you can get your points, so you can get your grade. And so in a way, like communication has 6 steps, your students have ways that they have to understand things. They have to understand what they're supposed to do and the definitions to support that, but then they have to interact with the organization of what's going on so that they can talk about and use those words, use the vocabulary to have meaningful understanding of what's happening. So we're going to give you a couple of examples from our fields so that you can understand where we're coming from, and then it's your turn to shine.
Okay, we're going to do a literacy example, but if you say, oh, I would like math, I would like to see math or other topics, I have them, and I'll email them to Pam and she can send them out if you want them. But literacy example, so language function. You're asking, what do you want your students to do? And so just choose a verb. And this is actually an example of my teacher candidates. I asked her if I could take it, and it's compare and contrast. So compare and contrast is the language function. I tell my teacher candidates that they have to teach what compare and contrast means. And they use the planning section of what they know about their students. So for example, their background knowledge, their culture, because how do I teach compare and contrast? Am I going to bring 2 different objects in and say, okay, what is alike, what's different about these 2 objects? Or am I going to say, okay, raise your hand if you know what compare and contrast is, and have the class come up with ideas and then come up with one definition. It depends on the background and the culture of your students of what you are going to teach, or how specifically are you going to teach the language function. And so, but I made my teacher candidates do that. And so compare and contrast. So this is the example. Compare and contrast Rachel and Veronica in the book Listening for Lions. That is what I want the students to do. Then I have vocabulary. Like I said in the intro, the vocabulary is content vocabulary. Just like Matt said, language function vocabulary, pretty much my teacher candidates were pretty solid. They would, especially vocabulary, content vocabulary. But here's the thing, the content vocabulary has to be in line with the language function. So these words right here are words that my teacher candidate students need to know in order to successfully compare and contrast Rachel and Veronica. Okay, it can't just be any word, but what words do they need to know in order to compare and contrast Rachel and Veronica in the book Listening for Lions? And so obviously we would teach this, and you can teach this in a lot of different ways in literacy, vocabulary boxes, acting it out, context clues. But syntax, okay, this is how I have explained it to my teacher candidates. Math syntax is going to be completely different. Your discipline might be different. But syntax is how are the students going to organize the information. So it's usually done in charts, in graphs, and diagrams. So compare and contrast, the graphic organizer that I'm using is a Venn diagram. But I had some major misconceptions with my teacher candidates when I started to do this. They would just pick any graphic organizer. But again, the syntax has to be related to the language function, and syntax has to have meaning. And so you're still teaching that the places on the graphic organizer mean something. And so you're going to have to teach words like, well, obviously, what does it mean to compare? What does it mean to contrast, similar, differences, etc.? And then where to place those on the graphic organizer. I tell my teacher candidates that sometimes, especially in literacy, syntax leads to discourse, because this graphic organizer is giving your students an opportunity to organize the information. I say sometimes even when I'm reading the Bible, I read something and I'm like, oh my word, what did I just read? Or read a book, what did I just read? And so syntax helps in literacy our students organize their thoughts. Then discourse. How do students express the language function? So the question on the worksheet is, how are Rachel and Veronica alike, and how are they different? So obviously my language function was compare and contrast, but I'm not saying that in the question. I'm saying alike and different. So I'm going to have to teach that those words mean compare and contrast. And so this is actually a sample response that one of their students did. It says Rachel and Veronica are alike because they were both 13 years old and lived in Africa. The two characters were different because Rachel grew up in a missionary family and Veronica lived in a well-established, wealthy family. They took this information from the graphic organizer, which could be a support, which we'll talk about later. But discourse is just explaining, orally or written, why Veronica and Rachel were alike and different. And you can see that they're using key words to help understand the differences between compare and contrast.
Now, that's really nice in a traditional classroom, but I come from the gymnasium. I come from performance. Performance matters. So, how would I do this? Again, language functions the same no matter where you are. The beautiful thing about edTPA is it's forcing a lot of different disciplines to use the same language. And so now we can communicate. So as we go forward through today, learn your academic language as you go through this. But, so what do? Well, what I want them to do is, you have a list of this in your notebook. Perform, describe, signal, analyze. So what I want them to do is analyze a basketball pick and roll play and perform it as an offense or a defense. That's it. That's what I want them to do. I want them to go in there and I want them to be able to understand what this play means and be able to perform it, because we're in a unit on basketball. We've gone beyond the basic dribbling, passing, shooting. Now we're into the tactical games. We're into the strategy. So, easy. I want them to what? Analyze and perform. Analyze and perform. There's my language function. So I need some vocabulary. Offense, you need to know what that is. You need to know what defense is, and most of the kids know that because they watch ESPN. Passing, hopefully they've learned what a chest pass and bounce pass and overhead pass is. Maybe a pick. What does it mean to stand there and pick somebody off so they come around the corner and pivot? Because you need to, after you pick, you need to pivot and roll to the basket. So maybe even open space, go into the open space or roll. You know, there's a lot of different vocab words that we can use. Most of us can pick this up pretty easily, but we want to put it within the context of basketball. We want to put it in the context of a sport. So it's not just that you understand that offense means you're going to do something and defense is you're preventing, but what are you doing in basketball? What is your job? So there, I've done it. Function, vocabulary. That's a level 3 in my area. They can do those two things. Now we got to go to how will they organize this? Well, usually I can do this with graphs. I can give them a support. I can give them a handout that says, can you read this? Can you read what an X is? Can you read what an O is? Do you know what an arrow is? So I hand them a play and it shows a basketball and it has X's and it has O's. And you go through and you say O's are for offense and X's for defense. And I'm going to run where the arrow points and the dotted line is a pass. And I'm going to explain that to them using the terms so that they can analyze the play and they can understand each one of those markings is syntax. Each one of those markings takes the definition and organizes it on a page so I can understand the discourse, which is the play. And then I say to my students, can you read this? Yeah. Can you go and practice? And then I'll be over there and I'll see if you can perform this play based upon this sheet. Now, the only trick to that, and this is where there's a lot of debate within my field, is if they just perform it, is that good enough? No, I'm sorry, it's not. It's close. It's really close. Because the problem with this is called modeling. I'm in one group. I don't know what's going on, but I can see what they're doing. Okay, I can do that. So what we need to do is just attach that a little bit of language to it. We need them to, can you perform it and tell me what you're doing while you're doing it? Or can you perform it and can you walk me through what's supposed to happen one-on-one? Because if I'm in a large group and in physical education, we can have 75 in a classroom, and you guys all know it, and God bless you for sending them all at the same time. Watch the student candidate do 72 kindergartners all at the same time. God bless them. It was more fun for me, I think, to watch the whole interaction. It was not a pause in the action. But if I pull them all together and say, what is offense, and one kid speaks up, my teacher candidate say, look, they understand. No, that kid does. Now, what about the rest of them? So we're still trying to figure out how can you pre-test and post-test 72 people and have it done in a segment of 3 to 5 lessons. So we're still talking to Pearson about that. But anyways, that's discourse, that's syntax in these two examples. So the other thing I can also ask them to do is, now that if you really understand it, here's a blank sheet of paper. Can you draw me a play that'll work? Make sure the defense is closer to the basket because they're defending the basket. Make sure the offense is farther away because they're shooting the ball. Can you just draw me a simple one? And then they're out the door. And then I can really judge if they're doing it or not. Oh, this is the other slide. I kind of went into it already. Using words or writing, they can actually perform it. They can talk about it. They can show me what a pick and roll is. But I covered that, so sorry.
Yeah, you did cover it. That's okay. So this is my favorite part of today is because we are going to ask you to participate. And so I want you to just talk to your, I'm so excited that we're in concentration. So we're all on the same subject. So I want you to introduce yourself to your table partners, mates, I call them shoulder buddies, whatever you want to call them. And we are going to ask you as a group to come up with one language function. So what do you want your students to do? That's the verb. So think about what you want your language function to be. Go ahead. Sorry.
You have to agree at the table.
Oh,
you can't have
that
10
might
different
be
people
the
doing different
hardest
things.
part, Matt.
Yeah, seriously. And if you're still in the back, just group together. There's also some seats up here. You can always come in and join.
Right. It would be beneficial if you did come to a table. We're going to give you maybe like two minutes. Okay.
Elementary minutes. 2 elementary minutes. It is only 45 seconds. I will say this, you can tell you were the bunch of educators because I heard people saying, well, let's do this, and then we can do this, and then we can do that. You're picking a verb. That's it. Just pick a verb. It won't get through it. Just pick a verb.
Okay, if we can stop what we're doing and here, look up here, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I have to tell a really embarrassing story real quick, and this is going to be completely vulnerable, but I just want you to know how, just collaboration. This process is about collaborating. It's not a competition. We don't need to be in competition between schools. We need to collaborate. And this is very embarrassing. So with the language function, in the beginning, when I first was like, okay, my dean came and she was like, okay, you need to do edTPA. We need your help. And so I was thinking about the language function. In the edTPA handbook, they give, I can't believe I'm about to tell you this, they give you the little boxes of the words. And those are just words that you could use. But for some reason, I had a misconception, and I was like, well, those are only verbs that we can use for our, And so I told that to Pam, and she was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, well, but I already told some of my teacher candidates, those are the only verbs that we can use. And one of the teacher candidates came to me, she was like, it really doesn't really make sense in my lesson. I go, I know, but I just don't know. And so then that's when I called Pam, and she's like, you are wrong. And so I just want you to know that it's okay that you have misconceptions. It's okay that this is confusing, because that's why we have to work together. That's why we have to collaborate on this. This is why it's going to be so good for our teacher candidates, because we're going to be working together to help them teach, and it's going to help with student outcomes. But would anyone like to raise their hand and or just share their language function? Okay, go ahead.
Classify.
Okay, classify. Does anyone else want to? Okay. Illustrate, perfect. Evaluate, those are all great. It's just a verb, go ahead. Retell, love it. I love retell. Okay, so now we have our language function, fantastic. Now we have to have content vocabulary. And so we're gonna ask you in your table groups to come up with vocabulary. Now think about it. We might just have to be a little bit creative for this one. But identify only the vocabulary associated with the language function. So what are our teacher candidates, or what are our students going to do? What words do they need to know in order to be successful in that language function? So, and then you're going to describe how and why the students will use the vocabulary or symbols, key phrases, to fulfill the language function.
Yeah, so in other words, what you're going to do right now is you're going to use that evaluate, retell. You're going to say, okay, now I got to put it in context. So just pick a story. Pick something that you could do within your discipline.
Just make it.
Physical educators will be right back there. Take a context that you have, and then say, okay, if I'm going to go in that direction, maybe it's a book, maybe it's a play, maybe it's something. Just write out those vocabularies. You're going to have to do a little bit more decision making now. You figured out your verb, now put it in a context and come up with just 3 or 4 vocabularies that would help your students within whatever context, whatever skill you're teaching, understand how to retell or evaluate or assess.
3 minutes, you think?
Yeah.
3 minutes. I absolutely love the fact that we're having all of these conversations. This is what edTPA is about. We're all from different universities, and we're having these conversations to help us understand just common language. And we're going to talk about common language. But does anyone want to share, just to make sense with the context, share your language function and then your vocabulary? Anyone want to share, please? We'll do voluntold. Oh, yay! Okay.
Well, our word is this.
We can't hear.
This word, and our listening is so our vocabulary first deciduous, indigenous,
Okay, great. Would anyone else like to share? Thank you. So I love all these volunteers. Okay, thank you.
And our word was detail our language function, and we were looking at the story Mary Hungry Caterpillar, and so we chose beginning, middle, end, character, setting, and sequencing.
Okay. Right? Okay, fantastic. Okay, now what we want you to do is, I make my teacher candidates do both. I just tell them, I'm like, you know, we're going to do syntax and discourse, because I think that's effective teaching, but you know, you have that 4 and 3. So syntax or discourse, we want you to come up with your table, syntax or discourse. So clearly identify what the syntax and discourse is that students will be using to fulfill the language function that you and your table have come up with.
Yeah, so in other words, how are they going to organize now those thoughts? How are they going to put that into an organizer? How are they going to use those vocabulary words to come up with some kind of overall meaning about the lesson?
Matt, I'm so sorry. I just interrupted him. But remember, it's got to be syntax and discourse. It's still got to be focused with that language function. How is it the organization going to help them with the language function? Okay.
We'll give you a couple of minutes to kind of discuss that. If you have questions, raise your hand. We'll be circulating.
If you can really tell what you're doing and hands down, look up here, that would be great. I'm not trying to be rude at all. We've only got 20 minutes left. We need to go through the report and assessment. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. We had some great conversations, but I was wondering if we could have one group maybe in the back want to share their syntax and discourse. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
The math people chose the language function of graph, and we said to just graph a line of positive slope, so we had some vocabulary, but our syntax would be like a coordinate plane or a table of values or even a graphing calculator, we figured.
Okay.
Would be the syntax.
Exactly. Graphs and anything that they have for organization would be great for syntax. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And like I said, I have a lot of math examples, and I can give those to Pam so she can email out. My friend Elise from Illinois State, she was like, people just want to see this, and so see what it looks like. And I have those if you want them. For sake of time, we're going to move along to supports. Supports are really important, and supports need to be focused on the language function. So what type of supports are you giving, our teacher candidates giving to their students and helping them, enabling them to fulfill the language function? This right here is the math rubric. This is actually the Pearson rubric. This is not the rubric. This is a rubric that's in your handbook. It's not the rubrics that we will be using for local evaluation. The local evaluations are different, and they have a little look for us. But when you are locally evaluating or evaluating if you're national trained, you always want to start with level 3 in proficient. That's where you want to start, the proficient. So if we look at the rubric, it says candidate identifies vocabulary and or symbols and additional language demands. And language demands, we know, are a language function or content, vocabulary, and syntax and discourse. So are they identifying them, the supports associated with the language function? And then you go down, plans include a general support for use of vocabulary and or symbols as well as additional language demands. If you go to rubric 4, or level 4, I'm sorry, it says plans include targeted support. So I tell my teacher candidates, that this is a perfect way to differentiate. You're going to differentiate through your supports. You might provide more supports to your lower learners. What type of different supports are you going to use? But all supports that, that will help them with their language function. But we can't forget about the targeted students. We have your average learners and you have your higher learners. And so Matt, actually, this has been fantastic, just this whole process, getting to know him, but he's really helped me understand this part. He'll come back and say it. But we need to make sure that we're supporting our higher learners too, to continue to move up. He calls it 2 levels beyond. And so all of these supports are helping them with the language function. So I've given you a couple of supports for literacy. Now remember, my example is, and I know my example we were talking about is pretty easy, compare and contrast. I wanted it to be easy for this. But it says, what will you provide the students to help them fulfill the language function in the learning task? That's the question that our teacher candidates are having to answer. And so the example, explain how Rachel and Veronica were alike and different. They first started off, my teacher candidate's first prompt was, discuss Rachel and Veronica. Well, that just ended up epic failure. And so then she made it a little bit more specific. Explain how Rachel and Veronica are alike and different. So we're having to support our students in understanding how to compare and contrast. So I'm teaching, I've had a lot of these conversations about teaching the language function. This is another support, I think, that I'm making sure that they know what compare and contrast is. So they're looking for the ways that something is like or similar to something else. Looking for the ways that something is different from something else. So then, how am I going to support them? Well, I have students in mixed ability groups that could be working on a Venn diagram. That's support because they're having that graphic organizer. Sentence stems. I make all my teacher candidates provide sentence stems. And I have examples. Class discussions with the Venn diagram on the board, used as a visual, guided reading. But this right here, for me, in this context, has helped my teacher candidates more than anything in this field. Because, especially with discourse, this, is helping them explain how Rachel and Veronica are different. And so the level of support that my teacher candidates might give to their students can be completely different. But if you notice that I have these key words that are just helping them compare and contrast. And so instead of me just saying, discuss Rachel and Veronica, well, they don't know what you're looking for. But if you give those specific key words, then they're going to be able to take the information from the graphic organizer, the Venn diagram, and then be able to orally or written explain it. That's a support. This has helped my teacher candidates and their students move to the next level. With some of the assignments and some of the field experiences that I've changed this semester, I would say that sentence stems have been the biggest support for for my teacher candidates.
Physical education. In physical education, again, I'm talking about the pick and roll. How am I going to support them? Now, Christy was really nice in mentioning, whenever you're doing edTPA, you have 3 individuals that your teacher candidate must interact with and target and show that they're assessing and you're looking at. In physical education, I tell my students, you want to hit a higher performer, you want to hit a lower performer, and if you have an IEP 504, hit one of them. Okay, why? Because it has to be across proficiencies. It has to be across levels. Well, if I'm coming up with a support, and I'm going to come in and say, okay, you got to read a pick and roll diagram. My high performance learners, they got it. They might even know what a pick and roll is already, and they're moving on to the next thing. Where my low performers are going, what is an X and why is there an O here? How do I sound spell this? Okay? They're not getting that it's a symbol. So if my initial support, my Venn diagram in Chris's example, is going to be where my low performers or my middle range or my target area is going to be there, is going to start at and struggle with and fail a little bit and then learn and then move on, I've got to have 1 or 2 more levels to help my high performers. It's not appropriate to say every day, hey, high performers, help somebody who's a low performer, because you're capping them. And we all know this. So what do? I say, okay, so I have, the example again is the basketball. They have to analyze, they have to perform as offense and defense. I've given them the support of a pick and roll sheet. So maybe the next thing that I do is I say, okay, now I'm going to give you a blank sheet of paper without the X's and O's, kind of like a word stem, and you've got to fill in where they're supposed to go. What happens if, when they roll, there's no open space? Can you draw me another diagram? These are my high performers, where they can go next. Can you understand the strategy well enough that you know what to do next? What happens if it doesn't work? How do you reset it up so that you can get the low post player in the position and I can come across as a guard and get it to my low post player or my strong forward or my weak forward or my center, whoever it's going to be. But then beyond that, I can say, okay, here's a blank sheet of paper. Now, can you draw me another play that you know of? If you have the ball out of bounds, where do you want your guys to run? So what happens is these next two steps up, my high performers are going to go at, and they're going to fail. And they're going to fail miserably. And then over time, they're going to be at 80% proficiency, which is a target in our area. And then we know I'm challenging, because edTPA likes the term challenge. I'm going to challenge those students. But if my low performers get past the first initial support, guess what? I just take them to the next support, because I've already planned that out for my high performers. So now I just move them to the next task. And they can all move together, and then I spend more time letting them experiment and learn and do, instead of me standing in front of the class, lecturing, telling, giving my own demonstrations and examples. So that's what I would do. So what we're going to have now is you're going to plan some more supports, the next two levels. What can you do beyond just that graphic organizer you've already planned? How can you continue to teach within language, academic language, so that your high performers can continue to learn and get more engrossed in whatever that language function that you did, and how can you still, so you can still support them as they move up, and you can still support those lower performers that are now progressing up to the next activity.
And even thinking about like, okay, I provided this support, this support, my students are still having misconceptions. Oh, I have another support, here you go, to help them meet the language function. Just like he said, you're going to have different levels. So what will you provide the students to help them fulfill the language function in the learning task? We are running out of time. We're going to give you 1 minute. Work quick. I think that the supports are very necessary for our students to fully understand the language function. Matt wanted to come, before we get into assessment, Matt wanted to come and talk briefly about something that the science people brought up. So go ahead.
Yeah, we have some great science people here. One thing that I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned to you before we talk about supports and everything else, as you're thinking about graphic organizers and as you're thinking about support, the science people said, hey, we like to do a lot of discovery. We like to do a lot of, they come up with their own conclusions. Some of you are doing that. We're walking you through the process in one way of organizing.
Right.
So you have to get the function first. And then you have to figure out what your vocabulary words are going to be. But you don't have to stand in front of the class and say, today we will compare and contrast.
Right.
And here are the definitions you must memorize. Now, let's go to our graphic organizers. Okay? If you want to do a discovery style or inquiry style, what you can do is just say, okay, today we're going to compare and contrast. So here's your activity. And they were talking about observing. There's a difference between observing and finding evidence and all this other. Observe is a very specific way of looking at the world, and in the scientific method, it's a way of using your senses to observe something, to look at something. So what they could do is they could say, today we're going to observe. Here's what you're going to observe. Here's a support. Fill out this graphic organizer at some point. It could be just write down everything you see. Write down, what do you observe? That's all it says, what do you observe? And they go through that. Then you can bring in other supports like articles or readings that says what's the difference between observation and non-observation. Then they go back and they can highlight what they think is a real observation and what is not an observation. Then you come back at the end and say, so what is the definition of observation? They come up with their own definition of observation, and you're there as the expert kind of This is what it really, okay, let me help you explain that a little bit more. Let me help you understand it a little bit more. Let me make sure that you have the definition down. And so at the end, you're going over all the vocabulary words after they've already experienced it. So maybe we did this whole conference presentation backwards. Maybe not. We'll see. So after, and here's the problem. You're getting overwhelmed. At least I would be if this is brand new to me. Okay, we've done, what is academic language? What are the demands? What are supports? How do I come up with this? All we want to do is introduce you to these concepts. You're going to have to wrestle with them for the rest of your life. But there's one more thing, and that's task 3, which is assessment. Big piece. There's a pre-test and there's a post-test. And you've got to be able to not only prove, as a teacher candidate, your teacher candidate not only have to be able to use the language function or the academic language themselves, but they have to prove that the students understand it and can use it. They have to prove it. So how do you do that? We're running out of time, so you're going to have to think about it a little bit. Ideally, you just kind of follow along with you have a central focus for that segment. You're following along. As you go through, you have your different functions for your different lessons. And at the end of the day, you give some sort of tangible way, whether they're going to talk about it and you videotape that, or they're going to write it down so that you have some kind of artifact that you can bring in with edTPA so you can submit that to Pearson whenever it's shown. And it's just one piece of paper from a student that's showing that they can understand what academic language is. And here, you definitely want to make sure that you're on your target students, your focus students. You want to make sure that you're getting feedback to them. You want to make sure that if they're struggling with it, you're helping them out. But you've got to come up with some kind of valid assessment, some way. And it can be something as simple as they fill out their supports. You don't necessarily, it doesn't have to be formal. But it has to be some way that you can show that they can use those words in the technical sense, in the field that you're in, so that they can understand what's happening. And then those work samples have to be uploaded. Those work samples have to be adjudicated as part of the edTPA grading process.
Okay, but student work is probably, I tell my teacher candidates, the best way to give student feedback. But in my example about my teacher candidate, when her students had a misconception, she gave feedback orally, which redirected them back to the language function, and you can timestamp that. And that could be an assessment as well. And so here at the rubric, again, you always look proficient. It says, candidates explain and provide evidence of students' use of language function as well as vocabulary or additional language demands. And so my piece for assessment, I like how Matt said it could be informal or formal. And I have to come over here because at Shorter, when we first had Dean and Pam come and local evaluate us, I was convicted. Dean convicted me. I was like, oh wow. I do not do a good enough job teaching my teacher candidates how to give feedback to their students. Corrective feedback that's related to the standard. Then when I kept going to these conferences, or when I just pick up the phone, what I did was on edTPA website, somehow I got charges for Shorter, I don't really know how. And lucky me. I just saw, okay, this person keeps on coming up on the website. So I just picked up the phone and called them. I was like, hi, my name is Christy. I have no idea what I'm doing. Will you help me? And everyone said yes. And so that's how Illinois State and I, and Vanderbilt and all these different people, and Pam, and that have helped. But my assessment piece is the weakest part in the nation. And so we have got to do a better job with this. So compare and contrast is my language function. So Venn diagram could be an assessment piece. I could just give it to them and say, okay, compare and contrast Veronica and Rachel. A simulated journal where they're taking on the role of the characters. But that wouldn't be assessment for compare and contrast. They would then take that and have to orally explain how Veronica and Rachel are different. That's just not enough. I could use menus to use differentiated instruction. what Matt was talking about. How can I challenge my higher learners? How can I challenge my lower learners and give them options? I can use rubrics. Here's a key point though. This is huge. My teacher candidates really struggled with this. They would do rubrics for, especially their discourse, and then the rubrics would say nothing about the language function. It would be about grammar. It would be about a grabber. And so it's really important that, okay, but you have to have something with compare and contrast in there. You have to have a section that needs to be the main part. Or you go back and review and teach those other parts that's going to be on the rubric. And then, because of D, I make all of my teacher candidates have a checklist as they're using proximity of control and informal assessments. They are taking anecdotal records and checking. They have the objective, the student's name, met, didn't meet. Here's what I'll do next. They're walking around, and I make them videotape themselves so I can, and I'm watching them. But and so they're doing that. That's helping them go to the next step, moving to the next level.
Performance arts.
When you're in a field that's performance-based, how do you demonstrate? Well, that's always tricky. As I said before, can they perform the pick and roll? It has to be connected to language. So sometimes you can do check for understanding. The whole group again is there, and one person's answering. That's one person that tells us the answer. They know. But in our case, we almost have to walk around with a checklist and watch them do it, and then pull them aside and say, okay, can you demonstrate this and explain to me, how would you teach somebody else to do this? How do you understand this? And check out the door, write down in a sentence or two what you find is going on. But also, drawing up those other plays, that's another way to do the discourse, because if they don't understand it, they can't draw the plays correctly. And that's one way that we can check with them. Whenever you're doing assessment, the most important part, and I concur with Christy completely, is it's the language function that's always first. It's always the language function. You have to connect to that. You have to. I was talking to a table, and they would say, well, how do we do these extensions for the higher learners? They've already read the story. They've already described it. I'm like, describe more. Put it in another context that's similar, but it's still, because the point is not that they're reading the same story, or you expand the reading, or you have them fill in the blank, but can they contrast something that's maybe not in the text? Maybe they can contrast something from another story, because the point is describing or comparing and contrasting. That's the skill they're learning. You're putting into the context of the story, or you're putting into a context. If you're in science, they're observing. What are they going to observe? How can they observe? Can they observe more? Can they use other instruments to observe? How can you expand that for them? Because it's always the language function first. And remember, the language function comes directly from the central focus. So as long as those are in alignment and you give them a valid way to assess, and that's something you're going to have to discuss because we are out of time, then that's what you need to do, and that's what we need to teach our students.
Okay, this is really important. I was in a conversation right there. And so I have discovered, I gave a real simple example because this is your first time doing it. But this is what I make my teacher candidates do. I want them to work backwards. So I have them identify the assessment in their learning segment that will produce student work. And then I'm going to say, okay, which of those formative assessments will allow students to demonstrate the fulfillment of the language function? Because that language function, lens, central focus, everything needs to match. And then I identify the language function being demonstrated, and then I ask them to identify the vocabulary, and then the syntax and the discourse. This has helped. Working backwards really has helped my teacher candidates understand. And so and I'll send you this. I'll give it to Pam. Everything, a big share. This is really important. So, the last thing we're going to say, because we are definitely out of time. This is what's going to help you. Here are references in the handbook, but I want to talk about rubrics and glossary. We need to support our teacher candidates understanding the common language. What are the rubrics asking for? What does that mean? And clarify it. Also use a glossary. Because central focus, we need to have common language between all of us. And the glossary will help us to discover a common language. We're out of time.
Real quick.
Ah.
This is going to be it, I promise. So here we are. It's going to be a long day. Some of you, this is brand new, and some of you are overwhelmed. It always reminds me of the first time I decided to drive a car when I was 16 years old. I'm driving, and the person teaching me is saying, look in your rearview mirror, look in your side mirrors, make sure you're doing this, don't go too fast, turn off. I just want to stay on the road, okay? And some of you are there, and that's totally fine. Stay on the road. Because just like our students, the first time we give them a lesson plan, are overwhelmed, but then by the end of the time of their student teaching or maybe some of their practicums, they can write out lesson plans very quickly. When you go through this process, at first it's slow, it's painful, and you really got to think about what you're doing. But over time, you'll be a better teacher for them as you learn how to do it. You've got to experiment with it. The last thing I want to say is this. As we begin this day, there's going to be a lot of academic language that you're going to have to learn today. So I challenge you, just accept it, learn it, ask questions, and hopefully we can all learn this edTPA together. Thank you very much.